What is up, guys? It's your boy, Mr. Tech Boy. Today I'm going to be talking about how Apple can improve iPadOS without ruining it for the average consumer. I'll explain what I mean by this, but basically, how can Apple add features to the iPad and how can Apple add software and apps to the iPad without making iPadOS extremely confusing for the consumer to use and understand. So without further ado, let's get into it. So if you've ever used any type of iOS device, iOS is designed to be extremely easy to use. Just simple app UIs, icons, are very easy to understand. There's not a lot of complex buttons. It's not a very complex operating system. That's why a lot of people love iOS, because it doesn't have millions of different simple features all cluttered together that can make it very difficult to understand how to do very basic things. This is the reason why people love iOS and all of Apple's software so much. But as Apple wants Apple's iPad to be a laptop and computer replacement, Apple has started to add a lot of new software features like multitasking, and to some people it's already quite confusing for the average consumer. So how can Apple add features that pros would want and people who want to have a full-on laptop and a full-on computer replacement without ruining it for the average consumer? In my opinion, there is two very distinct ways that I guess can be combined. So Apple can just add full-on sandbox, just everything that you can think of. They could add Finder, Terminal, Finder with full document app support, able to just load up different drives, open documents, load up Terminal, type in commands, do stuff with the software, just very complex stuff the average user wouldn't want to do. If Apple were to do that, and let's say your grandma opens, their iPad and they accidentally hit the Terminal app and they see a bunch of lines of code, they don't know what's going on, right? That's something that maybe a professional would know what they're doing. If you want to use the Terminal app to do these very specific commands, but for the average consumer, they're not going to know what that means. They're not going to want to use that, and it would be confusing to them. It's not just going to have the essential apps that a consumer would want. It's going to have professional apps baked into the software. They could make these apps just downloadable from the App Store in order to prevent confusion from customers, but I still feel like that would be very weird of Apple to do. I don't think they're going to allow you to have full Finder and Terminal and other app support. What I think it would make sense of Apple to do, and this is just one of my two ideas, is Apple to make a basic prosumer version of iPadOS. So if you don't want to have all the complex apps, you can just use regular iPadOS, which doesn't have these apps. And if you do want to use them, you can have this prosumer mode when you're getting the iPad. You can choose prosumer mode and you can have Terminal and Finder and blah 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 blah. This idea does have a lot of flaws, and honestly I don't think it would happen. Even though it does sound really cool, I don't think Apple would give you full control over a platform like iOS, which is made for consumers, as I've said, even if it was an option. So if you understand how Boot Camp works on Mac, it basically allows you to download Windows as a partition, as a separate part of your Mac storage onto your Mac. So I can boot into macOS on the storage drive, and then I can boot out of macOS and boot into Windows, and I can simultaneously, not together at the same time, but separately run macOS and Windows and boot out of each other. Macs have this, Macs have had this for quite a long time. It's actually really cool being able to boot into a separate operating system on your Mac. What I think Apple could do is something similar to this, even though it would be very difficult to implement and there's a lot of flaws with this idea, but hear me out. Apple could have the macOS downloader assistant, as I've mentioned, and when you hit it, it'll allow you to partition how much storage you want to allocate for macOS and how much storage you want to allocate for iPadOS. If you want to basically use a Mac, you really do need like at least 60 gigabytes. You can probably get away with less But to do basic stuff, you really need like a minimum of 60 gigabytes. Apple sells iPads with 32 gigabytes of storage. That would not work. Apple sells iPads with 64 gigabytes of storage. That wouldn't work either. The only thing that I think could barely work is 128. So if I have, let's say, half and half, one for macOS and one for iPadOS, if I'm using 60, about 70 or so for for macOS, and about 50 for iPadOS, you're still like, that's still a very small partition for a Mac. I don't think you should ever download or use macOS on a storage drive smaller than 128. I think like 128 is the minimum. So I would limit it to 256 gigabytes of storage. That way you could have like 200 gigs allocated for Mac, or 180, and then you could have some left over for iPadOS, just so you have enough. So they would definitely have to limit it. And there are a lot of other flaws with this idea. Big Sur has optimized macOS for ARM and Apple chips, and they showed it running on an A12X. So Apple could just modify it to work with the rounded corners and work with these iPads displays that are 11-inch and 13-inch displays, and I think it could work. They would definitely require that you have a Bluetooth keyboard and a Bluetooth mouse in order to use this, or maybe you could get a dongle and plug in a keyboard and a mouse. I think it would be great to advertise, Apple's keyboard accessory you can buy for the iPad, even though it's very expensive. That really solves the keyboard and mouse issue. That solves the issue of how much storage you're going to be able to have for macOS on an iPad. I think the only other issue is like RAM. iPads don't have enough RAM to run full computer apps. I think that if they limit it to the 2019 iPad Air 3, which has 3 gigabytes of RAM, and ARM, it'll be better at working with RAM than x86 chip. I think they could just barely get it to work with the 2019 iPad Air. Maybe the maybe the $329 iPad, but I don't think it makes sense to do that because of how limited you would be with RAM. I would limit it to either the 2019 iPad Air or the 2018 iPad Pro, because that has 4 gigabytes of RAM, or even limit it to the 2020 iPad Pro, which has 60 gigabytes of RAM. If you could run macOS on the iPad, you have the keyboard and mouse. You have enough storage in the iPad to do it. And you have all the stuff you need. You really get a very incredible 2-in-1. You get an iPad. You get the ability to run full iPadOS. Use social media with a touch, with your very own fingers. You can draw on the iPad. You can do basically anything an iPad can do. But you hold down some keys on the keyboard, you can boot into full macOS. You can run Final Cut Pro. You can run Logic Pro, Xcode. You can run basically any Mac app you want. That sounds really cool to me. I think that would make a great 2-in-1. And if you're on a budget for a Mac, you can easily get a very cheap Mac with this iPad setup. And you don't even need to spend all the big bucks on a really expensive Mac computer. You can just boot into macOS on your iPad. Would Apple ever do this? I have no idea. Maybe in the next few years, as they want iPad to replace computers for more people, eventually. I'm not 100% sure that they will ever do this. This video took a lot of time, a lot of thought putting into it. I have had a lot of ideas for how Apple can improve iPadOS over time, as Apple is getting closer and closer and closer to making the iPad this incredible computer device. 3 things that are not debatable for Apple to add to the iPad is the app library that iPad doesn't have as of iOS 14 that the iPhone does. It could work somehow kind of like Launchpad does on the Mac, where you open an app and it takes you to the app library of the apps that you don't want in your home screen or the dock, but you do want to have on your iPad somewhere. They definitely need to have a weather app. The fact that the iPad does not have a native weather app in 2020 is pretty sad. Craig, he made an excuse. He said, they haven't figured out a good way to do it. That was a garbage excuse. The iPad needs a weather app, and it needs a calculator, because iPads still don't have a native calculator app. You have to download one on the App Store. So yeah, add those, Craig or Apple. maybe add the macOS. And yeah, that's all for today's video. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Link in the description. Also check out the merch for Mr. Tech Boy. You can get a Mr. Tech Boy shirt, or you can get a sticker down in the description at Teespring. My name is Mr. Tech Boy, and I will see you guys all in the next one. Goodbye.